Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, finally, I'm talking about the new album from BT. Everything You're Searching For is on the Other Side of Fear. Alright, so I think it's been well established by now through all the videos I've done over the first half of this year and from years before that BT is one of my personal all-time favorite artists. I'm not going to break down all my thoughts on his previous work or do the In Brief segment, that's all been well documented. You can click the link in the description to get the playlist of my reviews of all his studio albums. The most important thing you need to know though is that his fifth album from 2006, This Binary Universe, is my second favorite album of all time, behind Only Orbitals and Sides, and one of only 4 albums I've ever awarded a perfect 10 out of 10 score. Coming from an artist previously known for making trance music, as well as dipping his toes into other dance music genres and even mainstream pop, he went all-out experimental with that one, bringing forth a super creative blend of IDM, ambient, soundtrack music, little elements of jazz and post-rock sometimes. So much interesting stuff went into it that felt like nothing any artist had ever done previously, and yet it all remained easily accessible with strong melodies and warm atmosphere. I could go on, but I already got a 22-minute video breaking down nearly every detail that came to mind about it. More importantly, BT has since done a couple of other albums in the same style as This Binary Universe, and has retroactively nicknamed them TBU2 and TBU3. The second installment, This Binary Universe 2, is his 2012 album If the Stars Are Eternal, So Are You and I, which had a bit more of a nocturnal, ambient-centric focus to it that touched in atmospheric techno and acoustic guitar balladry. And its opening track had full-blown dubstep breakdowns that didn't feel out of place despite the general low-key feel of the rest of the project. Not quite as intricately detailed as the original This Binary Universe, but has been a major grower as of fairly recently. Then TBU3, that would be his 2016 album Underscore, this big guy. This one was put together kinda weird, like you had a core album of 3 really long tracks, each broken up into several movements. You had 4 smaller demo-sized tracks tacked on the front and 2 longer ambient pieces with much less evolution than the main movement tracks tacked on in the back, coming together as an hour-and-a-half project that is really awkwardly paced and doesn't really feel like a cohesive album, but the music contained within all these tracks was so good that it didn't particularly matter. He managed to bring all the detail, texture, and atmosphere that I would have wanted, and despite the pacing issues, still hold up as great. The tracks Artifacture and Omega in particular sticking with me as among the best he's ever done, and the album ended up as my second favorite of 2016 overall. All of this needs to be brought up because this latest album he'd been advertising as This Binary Universe 4, directly continuing the lineage of all those masterpieces. There was some confusion in the lead up to this album. For a while he'd been advertising this album as being 2.5 hours, but then he released the track listing which only ended up to about 80 minutes, enough to fit on one CD, and he admitted later that when he said 2.5 hours, he had inadvertently included his ambient album from this past October, Between Here and You, in that calculation. How the hell did this happen again? At the very least, I'm glad he cleared this up before the album released. I mean, 80 minutes is a perfectly reasonable length for an album, and it had 16 tracks on top of that. Looked like it was at least going to have much more consistent pacing than Underscore. Feel like more of an album, hopefully. I had very high expectations for this, given how much I love its 3 predecessors. I had a feeling this was gonna be a last-minute shoo-in for my year-end list. And even with those high expectations in mind, this album still threw me for a loop a bit on first listen. It may have enough things in common with those 3 albums to justify the TBU4 label, but it sounds quite different from any of those albums, and from any BT studio album I've heard to date ever. And that isn't just because of the use of a full live orchestra and a full choir on several different tracks. That's a thing on this album. I knew he was going to be using it, but I figured it was going to be relegated to a track or 2, but no, there's orchestras all over this thing, often not even accompanied by anything, just standing on their own. But this album also sticks out like a sore thumb in his catalog to me because this album is easily BT's biggest downer. That may not be saying much. All of BT's albums try their best to be all uplifting and refreshing and mood brightening, and not to say this album doesn't also try to have some of those qualities, but this is also among his most stripped back and most minimalistic. Many tracks on here are even just pure solo piano compositions. BT doesn't usually do minimalistic, but that's definitely a quality that applies to this album. Between the abundance of solo piano and pure orchestral compositions, surprisingly well outnumbering the tracks where he goes into the usual This Binary Universe experimental styles, right from the get-go, this felt like BT's saddest album by a long shot. It was a sparsely arranged, emotional gut punch that I wasn't properly prepared for, with much less of the uplifting quality that pretty much everything else he's ever put out has. I was not expecting it to be so depressing. Was it actually good, though? Yeah, duh, of course it was. It was freaking great. I loved it from start to finish. Gonna be on the year-end list for sure. Not gonna top it, but it's definitely gonna be on there. This album was really refreshing coming from him. Great to see a new album from him that doesn't sound like any of his previous ones, and it may be a downer, but in the most comforting way that makes it hold up with repeat listens and motivate me to want to come back to it more and more. It's a harrowing emotional journey that really affected me and hit the spot, albeit not the spot I thought it was gonna hit. I'd probably rank it a tiny bit higher than Underscore, but not higher than If the Stars Are Eternal. Now, not to say I think this album is perfect. Similar to Between Here and You, I feel like this is the kind of album that I kind of picked up on everything I needed to get on the first 2 listens or so. I've listened to this album a lot. Subsequent listens didn't reveal a lot of interesting new layers to me, or things that I didn't notice before, or even really change my opinion from the initial reactions. There have been BT albums before that felt like they went a lot deeper than this, but I also never got sick of this album with any of my repeat listens. Also, I think there are a couple of minor pacing issues with this album as well. Not even close to as distracting as the pacing on Underscore, mind you. But a handful of the earlier moments kind of dragged, made me feel like we got off to a slow start. The album didn't feel like it properly kicked into gear for me until the Boolean query, and kind of sputtered out once I got to Carpe Noctem. Also think the album's ending felt a little abrupt too. But again, this was way better structured than Underscore. For one thing, this is not an album where it feels like one track felt more important than another. There's no giant standout like an Artifacture or an Omega, but there's no track that feels like it's wasting your time, or has no distinct identity, or doesn't service the complete whole. Also, the album has a solid continuous mix. All of these tracks directly link into each other and feel like they're really working towards a cohesive whole. This feels like this is exactly the vision that BT intended to carry out from the get-go, and he made it all work together really well. Maybe this was a collection of unrelated sketches at one point, but he paced them in such a way that kept me interested the whole time and took me on a journey. This has the size and scope that I would hope for out of a BT album, and properly feels like it justifies being a mainline project of his. So, may as well get into individual tracks. I will say the opener, L'Esprit de l'Escalier, or The Spirit of the Stairs in English, is the kind of thing to get you excited for what you're about to hear. It's BT's usual shifting, strange experimentalism, full of his weird effects, field recordings, chopped up pianos, percussion, orchestral elements. The kind of thing that lets you know, yep, we're in another This Binary Universe type album, get ready for some amazing stuff. Though, like, the next 3 tracks probably form my least favorite stretch of the album. It feels like we had a good intro to hype me up, and then it just kind of aimlessly wanders around for a little while after that. The second track, which I believe is pronounced Hyuga? I had to look that one up. That one was my least favorite track on here for a while, because despite being the longest track in the bunch, I almost never actually noticed it was even there. Of all the tracks on here, it's the one that most easily falls into the background. Though I don't feel totally right marking it as the lowest point, because there are a lot of interesting shifting elements that go into it, from its minimal pianos to ambient pads to some weird lo-fi piano recording in the intro that has like part of a fade-out looped for quite a bit. It's not like BT didn't justify this track being 8.5 minutes. It honestly zips by pretty quickly. Also, it transitions super seamlessly into the straight piano balladry of Eating Up Sunday. So seamlessly that many listens of this thing I didn't even notice this track had started until I was like halfway into it. It basically feels like a part 2 to the second track. but it does have its own identity too. While the second track was more experimental and airy, Eating Up Sunday feels a little warmer, more emotionally nuanced, BT doing some more complex chord progressions. Then we move on to Snow Suspension, which is a mini two-parter with its first half handled by a full choir with no further accompanying elements. Quite empty sounding, but in a very haunting and harrowing way. And a second half that brings in the orchestra and feels more expansive and warmer. Along the stretch of 3 tracks, there's no beats. It's basically pure ambience and piano without a solid pulse. And that's kind of what I mean when I say this album felt like it started out slow. It's also minimal and sparse, but again, it's all still really good stuff that had a lot of emotional weight to it. And then the album really starts to pick up. The Boolean query may not be one of the more emotionally charged pieces here, but it is BT having fun with his experimental beats, percussion that may be attached to a 4/4 pulse, but it's hard to tell given how it feels like all the percussion is placed at complete random. And the way this seemingly formless IDM-ish percussion goes up against his piano playing and various background ambient textures make for an experience that feels at once scientific and calculated, but also refreshing and uplifting. It's one of the happiest moments on the album. And then there's Orthogonal, which, if I had to pick one track on here as a personal favorite, it'd probably be this one. It's the only one with just like a straightforward techno beat underneath. At first it sounded like it was going to be in a 3/4 time, but then the bass line kicks in and it switches over into the standard 4/4. And that bass line is probably the single catchiest element on the whole album. It reminds me a little of that single he released in 2017, Yahweh. I really wish that made it onto an album. Oh yeah, and you gotta love that swirling orchestral pad that runs through the whole track. Gives it the sense of spacey melancholy and mystery. So yeah, that track is great. Then there's a quick minute-long interlude called Paraglide. Just a pure orchestral piece, but despite its length it felt like one of the biggest standout moments on here. The orchestral arrangements had some real dynamic range and swell. It sounds absolutely freaking gorgeous. Then Pale Antlers is another big emotional high point on the album. First, it's just a bunch of high-pitched, twinkly ambient synth pads, maybe a tiny bit Tangerine Dream influenced. But then the strings come in underneath and a piano melody develops, and it slowly builds and swells while staying really subtle and stripped back the whole time. Also sounds absolutely freaking gorgeous. The kind of thing that sounds very world-weary and tired, but still optimistic and ready to take on the challenges of the future. If Orthogonal is my favorite track here, Pale Antlers is my second favorite. From there you got another orchestral interlude in Thermocline, although this one is way darker and more lo-fi than Paraglide. There's a lot of artificial vinyl crackling and EQing of these achingly sad string progressions and choirs to make them sound like they came from another time and place, yet still feeling huge and expansive. And then it breaks into Eidos, which is more live orchestra, but without any extra filtering. The kind of thing that feels like it would play underneath the end of a movie right after, like, the main character dies or something. There's super low-key piano solos and cello solos, staying mostly pretty low-key, but again, BT knows how to make these pieces really have dramatic swell and dynamic range to keep things interesting. Perhaps a bit cliched sounding, but the emotion does undoubtedly carry across in a big way. It definitely feels like something special on this Binary Universe type album. And there's the menacing synth progressions of HPTK. These filtered bassy rumblings forming a sort of dark but optimistic build-up. A track like this that is quite strange sounding, but it has a feel to it that's simultaneously dangerous and motivating. Really nice. This is unfortunately where the best stretch of the album ends, but the remaining tracks are again still all really good. You got a very cold and minimal but comforting piano interlude in Anchorage. Lives up to its title in that it feels like you're taken out to the Alaskan city in question and watching the snowfall. Then there's Carpe Noctem, another piece for mostly unaccompanied choir that, while quite dramatic, admittedly gets a bit drawn out and repetitive. I think I prefer Snow Suspension. And there's 2 more solo piano tracks in a row, both pretty enjoyable. You got Piano in D, which melodically sounds kind of familiar. Can't quite put my finger on it. But it has a nice, cold and sparse quality to it, not unlike the second track here, but not quite as airy. It's nice. But then The Day That Half Started is probably my single favorite of the solo piano tracks. I think mainly because it reminds me of See You on the Other Side from the first This Binary Universe. But its repetitive rhythms and 5/4 time were really calming and emotionally resonant, and god, this one was so nice. You'd think given this album's already got no shortage of solo piano tracks that I'd be kinda sick at piano at this point, but no, not at all. All the piano tracks here have all had their own flavors to them, and he saved the best one for last. I half wish the album ended here because it would have been such a potent ending, but instead we finished with White Shore Drive, which is also not bad as an ending either. Very nice track with repetitive synth progressions going up against subtle bells and ambient pads in the background. Nice to end with one of the more layered pieces in the bunch, quite beautiful, though it is also quite short, and it just kinda sputters out uneventfully after 2.5 minutes. Is the kind of ending that had me feeling like, oh, that's it? You could've kept going. But whatever, that's every track on Everything You're Searching For is on the Other Side of Fear. Overall, this album didn't precisely knock my socks off, and there was a part of me going into it that wanted to be completely wowed by it, and was a little disappointed at how stripped back and subtle it was. But damn if BT didn't do stripped back and subtle really freaking well here. This is one of BT's best albums in years. It's a little better than Underscore for me, certainly more cohesive and the kind of thing that had me coming in for many repeat listens. I've already heard it like 10 times, and like I said, I am not remotely sick of it. It's not BT's deepest listen, and he's not closing out the decade in as high a spot as where he started. I don't know if I'd be able to expect something as good as These Hopeful Machines from him at this point, but he is still finishing the 2010s, still on top of his game. Other Side of Fear is instrumentally rich, emotionally potent, creative and very unique in its particular execution, super cohesive and streamlined in such a way that I never feel like skipping tracks or moving them around, but also easily varied enough to maintain my interest, and I love the whole thing. It's his best album in a very long time. Make sure you give it a shot before the year is over. I'm overall feeling an 8.7 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.